Hey everybody, Johnny B. Good here. Hello and good evening. Greetings from Dayton, Ohio. Once again, today is Sunday. Happy Sunday, everyone. September 22nd, 2019. Local time, it is 9:42. Temperature is 82 degrees. Grace and I are continuing our journey to Madison, Wisconsin. But obviously we're not going to make it that far tonight. I think we're going to find a place between Richmond, Indiana and Indianapolis. But we do have 3 hours and 29 minutes remaining to drive, so but then again, I have less than a quarter of a tank of fuel left, so yeah. I feel a little bit guilty that I left you with, kind of unloaded you with the story of Alfredo, and I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if you've seen a video yet or not, but forgive me for sharing that burden to you guys. And I didn't want to leave you down in the ground with that story. But I tell you what, it really does help when you tell someone, right? So anyway, this next story, I'm hoping that it can pick you up a little bit. It's about a story of a lot older gentleman back in the barrio of Liong, and we shall call him Americano. I don't know. He was my mom's age, but he's one of those guys that refuses to grow up, refuses to act their age. Very funny guy, very good sense of humor. His real name was Eustaquio Salon. Oh gosh, don't ask me how to spell his real name. All my life we've always called each other Americano. Americano! Either if he would see me first, he would yell out, or I see him first, I'd yell out, and he would call me the same thing. Alright, anyway, so Eustaquio, or we call him Eustaquio. Yo-yo means tío. Yeah, I think in Spanish, right? Tío. Eustaquio. He was a very interesting character because, and somehow he always had this fondness of me, because believe it or not, as a little boy, I had blonde hair, very, very light skin, as many mixed children in the Philippines. If you know, the day the kid is born, you would think that the kid is just pure white kid, but the older you get, the more local hood, the darker you get eventually. So anyway, when I was a little kid, 1974, 75, of course, Eustaquio was already married. In fact, his kids were one of the kids in the village. His daughter is actually my brother's my older brother's classmate. And as I mentioned many times, many years, there wasn't a house in the village that I did not either go in, eat in, sleep in. I mean, I don't know. It was like in a very small village. I guess everybody goes everywhere. So as I was saying, Takyo was he had this incredible amount of fondness of me and my brother because it reminded him of the Americans. You see, Takyo was about 14 years old when the American-Filipino-Japanese War ended. When the Americans finally went back to the Philippines and liberated the Philippines from the Imperial Japanese Army. And according to him, before the war, he traveled from Camiguin Island to the main island of Mindanao. You see, Camiguin Island sits about 7 kilometers away from the main island of Mindanao. And when he migrated looking for work at the age of, I don't know, 10, 12, at a very young age, he traveled to the town of Bogo, or Puerto Bogo, which is in Cagayan de Oro City. And then the war broke out, and he could not get back to the island, and so he was kind of left to fend for himself at a very early age of, teenager age. And according to him, he used to tell me these stories of how he had to survive. He would have to gather foods of birds, fish, and go up in the jungles and just basically hunt and fend for himself. And he was so poor that he didn't have anything. The only clothes he had was a burlap sack. It was one of those, let's see how he put it. I would imagine it's the same kind of sack that they used to haul potatoes with. Those big, thick, heavy kind. And that was his clothes. And so finally the war ended. The Japanese Imperial Army surrendered. And so he came off from the mountains, and the first thing he saw was this American soldier. Back then in that era, American soldiers were called GI Joes. And you don't call them, hey, GI Joe. Well, I think it started that way, then people kind of made it short to, hey, Joe. Until to this day, when Filipinos, I think the older generation, I don't know about the young kids now, but in his generation and my generation, if Filipinos saw a Caucasian foreigner, regardless of what his nationality was, Everybody yelled out, "Hey Joe, come, drink some coconut wine." Hey Joe. It didn't matter if he was German, French, or South African or whatever. If you were white, somebody would call you Joe. And believe it or not, a lot of foreigners kind of resented that. I'm not American. But anyway. So finally, when the Philippines was liberated by the Americans, he came down and yelled at the first, American GI, "Hey Joe." I don't know why, but he spoke English, not fluently, of course, broken English, but for the most part, it was very understood. And so he said he was walking around very hungry, and his clothes was made out of a potato sack of some sort. And so he comes up and gives shakes the GI Joe's hand, and he said, "Joe, you have any food? Me hungry." So apparently the American soldier gave him something to eat. After he was done with that, he said, "Joe, you have any clothes I can wear? Look at my clothes." And apparently this American soldier had an extra uniform on him, ripped the name tag out of this uniform or the patch, and gave him a pair of army fatigues to change to. The problem was he was only about 5'5", and this American was, at least 6 foot tall. And so he said he had to fold those pants and those sleeves just so he doesn't fall off. And ever since he had to love the softness and the fondness of Americans. He never forgot the kindness of the act of kindness that the American soldier showed him. Oh, he used to tell me all kinds of stories about the war, about the cruelty of the Imperial Japanese armies and the hardship, and oh man. But I would, as I mentioned in the earlier videos, that the whole village was dark. There was no electricity. And my brother and I, we would have the tendency to see, our house was located about 3 or 4 blocks away from the main village. And from my house to the village was completely dark. If you didn't have, if there wasn't a moonshine night, it was really pitch dark, and the roads were made out of gravel and rocks, and if you're not careful, either you'll fall into a pothole or baseball size or softball size rocks in the middle of the road. And of course, back then everybody was wearing slippers, or we call them chinilas. Anyway, my brother and I would occasionally, more than often than we care to admit, we would end up playing in with the kids in the barrio. And you know how kids are. We were supposed to go home before it gets dark. And well, we didn't. So my brother and I never really hang out together. But we both shared the fear of going home in the dark. And so, of course, my brother and I would, individually try to go home, and we would beg the older kids, to walk us home. What made it worse is people would make up this horrific stories about certain spirits walking at night and dragging chains and all kinds of stories to make kids just, crap in their pants. And there was this one particular boulder that was just, I tell you, this boulder was as big as this truck. And supposedly there was this very white, a white dressed lady that would glow at night, and she would sit on that boulder. Now the story goes is that she would wait there. She would sit there and wait for her dad, I think it was, to come and pick her up. Obviously, dad didn't pick her up, so. But that was a very, very popular story back then. Oh, it made my hair out of stand up and my chilling bones, and that's why I couldn't go home by myself when it got dark. And more often than I can remember, I would always beg, Takio to walk me home. Gosh, I can't remember how many times he has done that. And him and my mom were very good friends. He also talked to my dad and stuff. So as I migrated back to the Philippines, as I mentioned, that I mainly lived in the big city, and I would go home back in the barrio for a week. I would go home for a vacation. Then I would go back to the main city of Cagayan de Oro and finish high school and all that stuff. And every time I would see him, he just had this beautiful big smile. We would just call out each other, Americano! And of course I would try to talk to him in English, and he would respond in his broken English. I think right after high school, my dad bought me an enduro motorcycle. It was a Honda 200 XLR. Now he would, at that time, I rode like a stupid idiot, and you know how those stupid idiots you see on TV or on YouTube. Yeah, I would drive real fast. So I was kind of known as the speed demon in the village, and people rarely people rode in the back of my motorcycle because they were very scared that I rode too fast. But for some reason, this now an elderly person, he would, people would dare him to ride with me, and I would do all kinds of stupid, idiotic moves, try to scare him off my motorcycle. And for some reason, he would just laugh and says, I trust you. I know you know what you're doing. So we even got closer, right? You know, when I was in college age. I did go to college. I did. I went to the college every day. I just never went to class, but I was in college. Get it? even in my early 18 to 21 years old, him and I got closer, but by then he was getting old. And one time when I started living here in the United States back in 1991, I went home for a couple of years, you know, every year for a couple of months. I would go trucking for 8 months or so, save up my money and go home. When that ran out, came back here, do it all over again. At my visit, he wasn't doing too good. I don't like where this story is ending. But I mentioned to him that in case we didn't see each other again, I was saying goodbye to him. We kind of both knew that that was the last time. But the fond memory I have of that guy, it was priceless. Even today, their kids would talk about, you know, the bond that we had, him and I had, and I guess in their dining table, he would always brag about, you know, the stupid things I did with the motorcycle with him, and I guess that was one kind of a story that was part of their family, I guess. And his kids would, you know, somehow still mention those stories. And when I was back here in the States, I heard news that he passed away. I guess he was still alive when I brought my dad home. because I remember he attended the wake and the burial of my dad. But then again, that was the last time I was able to go home. 18 years ago. Believe it or not, I don't consider him a loss. He was a very sweet and kind man. I have all kinds of sweet and fond memory of him. For some reason, I don't know why. Growing up at the age of from 18 to 20s, I mostly hanged around with older people then. I didn't really hang around with the kids I grew up with anymore. I don't know. I had this, what do you call it? Curiosity and fascinations. Talking and listening to all these older people in the barrio. I was always fascinated by how they survive and how they lived, when they were young in their generation. And that was the story of Americano. I hope I get to see him in heaven someday. Anyway, hopefully I brought you up again. Thanks for listening, everybody. God willing, we'll see you tomorrow. Johnny B. Good here. Have a good and godly day. Peace.